All right, take your seats. Let's get started. All right, take your seats. Let's go. Do we have any faculty announcements? Mr. Denosa? Other faculty announcements? All right, students. Doug. Why? Yep. Does that count? Any other announcements? All right, Schaefer, where's Wyatt? Yeah, you got a question? Good question. All right, to piggyback on that, remember the winter clothing drive, the bin is like half full in there. If we get enough clothing, remember our goal is like 250, 300 pieces of clothing. We get it dressed down, right? So we have one tomorrow. We get one next Friday too. So keep, look around your house. I'm sure that there's some things you've outgrown that you can throw in there. So remember to do that tonight. Julian.
Dr. Onaje Exo Woodbine is a former Yale basketball player and teacher at Phillips Exeter Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, where he taught philosophy and religious studies, supervised the dorm, and coached basketball and track and field. While at Phillips Academy, Dr. Woodbine wrote the book, Black Gods of the Asphalt, Religion, Hip Hop, and Street Basketball, which has garnered national praise and a profound narrative of survival and self-determination in this season where black male bodies are under attack. Covered by the New York Times, NPR, ESPN, and Boston Globe, the Black Gods was longlisted for the 2017 ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. Dr. Woodbine will be an assistant professor of philosophy and religion at American University in the fall of 2018. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Woodbine.
How's everybody doing? All right. I'm excited to be here. It's a privilege and an honor to be at Gilman School. I want to thank Mr. Foreman for inviting me and Tangi for making me feel welcome with you today. I want to talk to you a little bit about how I came to want to study street basketball as religious experience. And the title of the talk is, What is Your Working Paper? The theologian Howard Thurman, who was Martin Luther King's mentor during the Civil Rights Movement, said that each human being carries with them a working paper. Thurman used the phrase working paper as a metaphor to describe the central problem, idea, or question that animates an individual's life. And often this problem or question comes from your own story, from your own lived experience. there's something in us that causes us to question what we really value, who we are, what is our purpose. And I want to share with you how I came to understand my own working paper, and that it had to do with the search for meaning and transcendence in basketball. I grew up in inner city Boston, okay, and this is a slide of a memorial that some guys in the neighborhood put at center court after a young man was murdered. And they interviewed this guy who was shooting, and they asked him why he was out there. And he said, I can talk to the young man who was killed. His name was Jay Wan. He said, I can talk to Jay Wan through my jump shot. Right? And you see, a lot of guys would go to the court to speak to the spirit of the deceased. So I grew up in this context, and this was natural. Right? We all went to the court to grieve. And it was the only space where I really felt safe, where I felt like a human being. And I want to share with you a couple of examples of other young men who felt the same way that I did growing up. There was a guy named Tyshawn. He described the moment on the basketball court where it took him beyond the streets. He said, man, it's just like you forget what's going on the outside world. For that, however much time you're on the court, you don't know the time of day. Everything is blacked out between those four lines. That rectangle is your whole new space for being human. There was another ball player named Marlon. He described being on the court as though his spirit was leaving his body, and allowed him to perceive events outside the bounds of linear time. He said, I feel like a free spirit when I'm on the court. It's like, you know how they say your spirit goes to a different place, whether it's heaven or hell, or you get stuck in between in the afterlife? I feel like my soul overtakes my body, and it just does what it does out there. And then people are always asking me, how do you do that move? I just get a premonition on the court. So if I see it happening, I already know I'm going to dunk on somebody. And then there was a guy named Jermaine. He was known for soaring above the rim. He said, it's like nothing can slow you down. Nothing is going to take you off that cloud. It's electrifying. So this is what I saw growing up in my neighborhood. And then I lost my best friend. His name was Marvin Barrows Jr. And I didn't have a father growing up. But I had a coach named Manny Wilson. And when I was 12, he died in the streets. And I remember going to the basketball court, and I was looking for Manny. I was looking for Marvin. Every shot I took, when the ball went in, it was a sign to me that they were there, that there was life after death. But I was depressed. I was hurt. When I was 15 years old, my father came back into my life. And he taught me how to access something special inside of me that no one could take away. He called it the still small voice within. He taught me to listen to it and to cultivate it through meditation and breathing. And I remember when I went back, he was living on the West Coast. I went back to Boston, to the inner city. It was still gang violence everywhere. But I remember I turned basketball into a moving meditation. I would go to the court to listen to that still small voice. It was like my raft. His words gave me a different orientation regarding my place in the world. I was greater than the stereotypes of race and masculinity that were so toxic in my neighborhood. I began to really care about reading and writing and learning, not based on what I could gain from it, but for their own sake. Because I knew that engaging in those practices would help me discover my purpose. And all of a sudden, it was amazing. My grades, I was failing before I got close to my father. Then I started getting straight A's. My basketball skills developed. My relationships developed. 3 years later, I was admitted to Yale University. Don't tell me how. I don't know how it happened. But literally, it was just listening. It was almost as if the universe responded to my commitment to live from my own moral center. So while I was at Yale, I arrived on campus, and by the time I was a sophomore, I was the leading scorer on the team. I was selected all Ivy League. Okay? I had an opportunity, most people thought, to make it to professional basketball. But I remember my last game against UPenn. I came off the court, and something inside me, I had been using the game to listen for so long that it was just natural for me. When I came off the court, something inside said, I'm not going to help the most people by simply putting the ball in the basket. So that year, I quit the team. I wrote a letter about why I felt called to study philosophy and religion. And the letter basically said, it was because I was still trying to answer that question, who am I? I was still working on my own working paper. So I quit the basketball team. Amazingly, a few days later, my letter came out. It was in the Yale Daily News. The dean at the School of Theology at Boston University wrote me a letter. I got it in the mail, and he said, why don't you come to Boston University to do a PhD to fulfill your promise, right, to fulfill your purpose, to try to answer those big questions. So I graduate from Yale, I go to BU, and I was also back in Boston, near the same courts where I first experienced my full humanity. So I decided to use my graduate studies to go back to the courts, to try to make sense of the role of basketball in the lives of black boys and men. I knew if I could understand the complexity of sports in my own life, I would also be serving others who shared similar experiences. I was using my own lived experience to explore and name a problem that existed in the world. Some of the best scholarship and innovation is done when it comes from your lived experience, from your own authentic place. So several years later, my research led to writing Black Gods of the Asphalt, in which I tell the stories of hoops in the lives of black men in U.S. cities. And it was really the culmination of my own working paper. So there's a couple lessons from, I think, my experience that I want to leave you with. And we want to save time for questions, because I really want to interact with you. But what lessons do I have to offer? The first thing is, everything depends on your willingness to stay true to yourself, to hear that still small voice within and anchor yourself there. Thurman writes, there is something in every one of you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It is the only true guide you will ever have. And if you cannot hear it, you will spend your life on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. Second, this means that when reflecting on your purpose in life, you need not ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive, says Thurman. And so I leave you with this question. Do you have a working paper? And if so, I challenge you to go do it. Thank you. All right, so I really want to interact with you. Ask me anything about me or my findings in basketball, masculinity, race, anything. Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you for the question. So when I went to my coach's office, he slammed the desk. And I got a letter from him the next day. And it was a racist letter. He basically said that I had only been admitted to Yale because I could play basketball. And not only that, but that Yale would hesitate to admit other black students if I left the team. Right? And the implication was that Yale only admitted black males if they were athletes. Right? I was devastated because I thought that he cared for me and that he had my best interests in mind. But I began to realize that the assumption was that if you were an athlete, you were deficient somehow in mind or intellect, especially if you were black and male. And so I began to realize how subversive my decision to leave the team was, right? Because I was, in a sense, rejecting that narrative. Right? So yeah, it was difficult. It was very difficult. I wrote a letter back and had a few conversations, but we've never really been able to reconcile what happened. Yeah, I think for some people, the best way to do that is to continue as an athlete. Right? Athletes and the playing field can be an amazing space for protest, for social change. But I think for me, growing up in the inner city, there were only really three identity options. You could be an athlete, you could be a rapper, musician, or you could be in a gang, especially for black men. You could do other things, but you were an outsider if you went another way. And a lot of times the gangs would give you a pass if you played sports. They would say, you know, we don't want you to participate in the gang. You're special. Right? And so I put it was really life or death for me. I put everything into the game growing up because it was the only thing that allowed me to be free and safe. And so what happened when I transitioned from that to Yale, my world opened up, and I hadn't done enough work on my own self, and I hadn't been exposed enough to the variety of resources and opportunities that Yale had to offer, that I realized personally that if I continue just focusing on sports, my own identity would be distorted in some way. So for me personally, I had to let it go to save myself. Right? But I think if you don't grow up in that context, and you grow up in another context, and you're exposed, and you also are in sports, it's wonderful, right? And you can continue on and still. But for me, and in college athletics, you play, you practice, you lift weights, conditioning probably 4 or 5 hours a day, and then you play twice. So the only day off is a Sunday, and you're exhausted, right? So for me personally, I don't think I would have been able to protest that way if I had stayed. But that's not to say that others can't. Yeah. Yeah, so one of the most difficult things was finding language to describe what I knew in my bones and what folks were doing in my community, how they were living. And the study of philosophy and religion gave me conceptual tools, ideas to help make what was really a private experience in this community more public. I could use public language, right? Language that others would understand to make the experience accessible to a wider audience, right? But at the same, the danger in that is that you can also strip communities of their agency, of their own lived experience, right? So as an academic, it's wonderful to use the resources in the academy. It's necessary, right? Because it helps you think and gain a perspective on your own experience and others' experiences that you wouldn't have had before, right? A lot of the young men said, I just went to the court to grieve. I went to the court to hear the spirit of somebody who died, but it was normal. I never thought of it as anything religious, right, or special. So now I have a better understanding, and now I can consciously use the space to grieve, right, and for social transformation. But at the same time, you don't want to over-determine the space by placing a lot of theory and that stuff. So it was a real balancing act. Right? I would use the theories, but then I also always let them tell the story through their own words, right? And try to maintain that balance.
Doctor, understanding that small voice that you're speaking about, and I had that same experience, which caused me to get out of the music stuff I talked about, to do what I'm doing today, 40-some years later. Can you talk to the kids about, or students, what that inner voice is? Some of them may not even have the idea of how to identify it, how it occurs. Some may think it's actually verbal. There's something, you hear something, or no, help them to understand what that still small voice is.
Yeah. So, Mr. Foreman asked, how do you describe that still small voice? How do you connect with it? The first thing I would say, it is beyond words, right? It's not as though you necessarily hear right, words or something within you speaking. It's felt, right? It's something within that lets you know you're a human being, right? And I found that where people discover it the most is in the things that make you feel alive, right? The practices that you have, whether it's art, music, dance, through literature, right? That feeling you get that lets you know that you're alive, right? And there are practices and tools within the religious traditions that help people cultivate it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that, right? You can meditate and sit quietly and become aware of something greater inside yourself. Or it could be, these guys when they're playing basketball, right? I think it's important that it's difficult to capture or describe. The reason why I say that is because if there's something inside of you that you can't box in, right, that you can't classify through language or words, then it also means, right, that no one can classify you, right, that no one can box you in. You're always able to critique whatever circumstances you find yourself in, because there's something in you that wasn't given by the larger culture. Right? So it is very difficult to describe, right? But I discovered it through my father and through the relationship with my father and listening to it, right? Thurman calls it the sound of the genuine. Again, it's hard to name, and that's the beauty. That's the beauty of it. Yeah. Yes, sir. Project Numa. Wow. Wow. That's a really great question. I have thought about this in the context of street ball and grief. I met with a child trauma specialist. His name is Dr. Robert Macy, and he was commissioned by President Obama to study childhood trauma in the U.S. He's among 10 trauma specialists. And when I shared with him my own work, his first response was that there was probably an ancestor on the court with these guys. And he talked about, he called it the morphological field. And he said that scientists now have tools where they can measure the amount of energy within the body. And he said that the heart produces the most amount of this energy, and that when somebody's traumatized, their heart rate increases, and that when they go to the court, they're likely to produce enough energy to enter this morphological field and connect with an ancestor. And so what I've done is drawn from tools in traditional African philosophy that they have this, it's called a divination board. It looks like just like a basketball court. To turn the court into a ritual space consciously, to call the energy there so that when somebody dies, we turn it consciously into a ritual space and reconnect with that person. The reason why I've tried to do this is because from this perspective, the cycle of black-on-black violence in the inner city has not just a structural sociological root, but also a spiritual one from this perspective. And that if the dead are in turmoil, they're likely to create a similar condition among the living. And part of the ritual process is to free the living from the dead and vice versa, so that both can be in a healed space. And so we created this rite of passage on the court. I have it online. You can go online, and Mr. Foreman can share this with you. You can go online and go through the whole ritual process virtually with headphones and so forth, and go through that whole process. But I'm also, last thing is I'm also working with a Taoist, Tai Chi person, to think about breath, he calls it breath play, and using that in the space as well. But that's sort of the next place where I want to go, definitely.
Any more questions?
Yes, in the middle. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when I was in graduate school, my first class was a professor. He was a psychologist of religion. And he asked me, he had an assignment, called it Turning to the Subject, Turning Within. And the assignment was define religion based on your own personal account. And it led me down basically what I just rehearsed today. Led me down this path to realize that scholarship could come from my own lived experience. I had never assumed that that could be the case. I always thought that everyone outside of myself were the experts. The other reason why that was important as an African American is that most of the stuff I read was written by white men. And I always felt a resistance, a tension there, because many of the folks that I read had in their works justified my own dehumanization. Right? If you look at Western philosophy. Right? And so I always struggled. How do I use these tools to dismantle, the system that has dehumanized me, when these tools are the ones that have created it? And so realizing that my own lived experience could be a source of theorizing was liberating for me. Once I realized that, then I was able to pursue academics without that cognitive dissonance. The other thing that happened to me is I went to Nigeria. I went to Nigeria that same year, and I was reading Invisible Man in Nigeria. And I realized, I said, wow, I've been running this whole time, and I had been lied to. So I sat with shamans. There was 5 shamans, and they read me like a book. I didn't know them. I didn't say anything. And they were having this intellectual debate about my purpose and values and stuff in front of me. And they were sitting on the ground, no text, memorized. They had these stories that they memorized. And I realized I had been lied to. Everything I had been taught about Africa was a lie. So it just peeled back, and I was able to say, I can be an academic too. Yeah, great question. So I'll answer that by telling a quick story. When you go to a basketball court in Roxbury, where I grew up, the gang members are around the court, and the stakes are really high. And I remember walking to the court, I had to add a little limp to my step. I had to look tough, right? I had to assume normative definitions of black masculinity, right? Stereotypical ways of being a man, right, in the neighborhood. And that's how it was on the street, right? Sexual conquest, right? Thinking that in order to be a man, right, you have to conquer women, right? All of these things were this toxic ideas around what it means to be a man. And I didn't have role models to show me something else. But I knew inside of me that wasn't me. So I was struggling until I was about 15 when I got close to my father, struggling with that. It's like, this is not me, but I don't fit in if I don't assume this. How do I figure it out? It's interesting when you walk to a court, you have that. When you enter the actual court, the gang members are around the court. When you pass the chain link fence, you can let that go. You can let that go because it's safe. You don't have to be tough. You can cry. You can show emotion, right? You can do all of these things. And there are women around the space that give you permission to do that. Very important. But when I was 15, my father showed me a completely different definition of masculinity. That power, his idea of masculinity was that it's about surrender. Power is surrendering to the other, submitting to the other. And he would talk about Tai Chi in that form. If anyone has studied Tai Chi, you know that it's by letting go that you gain the most power. Things like that. So,
Thank you.
thank you.